Can I ask you first of all about the news that broke over the weekend, the leak, the magnitude of it? It's quite a thing. What your first thoughts as you heard it, Charles?
I thought it was shameful, really shameful. I don't know what the motives for it were, whether personal ambition or scoring some political point. But if ambassadors can't rely on their confidential communications being confidential and kept so, then we are in a pretty pickle, because governments need an honest assessment of, from their diplomats of foreign countries and the personalities running them. If they can't enjoy that, what's the point of a diplomatic service?
Jonathan, you worked in the Washington Embassy years ago, didn't you?
Yes, so did Charles before me. He was private secretary to the ambassador. Indeed, when he did that, I was the second under gardener, so I had a lower rank than him at that stage.
Probably paid more.
Yes, it was very enjoyable. It was really appalling, the leak. And what was interesting about it is two things. One, that it was over a very long period of time. So it was right back to 2017 through to just after the state visit. So it's someone very deliberately taking a series of papers over a very long period of time. And then the recipient of it, who is a Tory Brexiteer type person, is interesting and gives you some indication perhaps of the motive.
The government's been clear to say they do not suspect a third country. Can you completely banish that idea from your mind?
Well, it crossed my mind, certainly. I first thought this was a sort of WikiLeaks type of thing, and maybe involving the Russians. But if the government said that, they probably have reason to think it, in which case they may have a pretty good idea of who the leaker is. In my experience, I don't know whether Jonathan feels the same, leak inquiry is a complete waste of time, because everyone knows who leaks it, but no one can ever prove it.
Jonathan, you think it's got something to do with the current political climate, and therefore presumably with people positioning for the transition to a Boris Johnson administration?
Yes, I mean, there've been a whole series of attacks on civil servants, on the cabinet secretary, on the former negotiator on the EU, all of a part by Farage and people from the Brexit side who seem to be keen to get rid of these people, and that's what I think it's about.
What does that tell us about the incoming administration?
They're not terribly interested in the way the Constitution works.
What do you think, Charles?
Well, I would take a rather sort of broader view of it. I think it reflects, first of all, ignorance of the procedures of good governance. I think it reflects an obsession with one subject, which is characteristic of our politics at the moment, which is Brexit, Brexit, and Brexit. Nothing constructive, no well-argued, well-researched policies, just an obsessive fanaticism about Brexit, which is deeply disturbing, because we need government, we need good government, we need policies. And as a member of the House of Lords, I've sat there over the last 9 months, say, certainly since last November. We have not really had any legislation because the government hasn't had any laws to introduce. There is nothing going on. Government is dead.
You both worked on transitions. Jonathan, you for when Tony Blair came in, and Charles, you stayed on a bit to help John Major take over after Margaret Thatcher left office. How does this transition look like it's shaping up? We should be at a period of, from your memory, intense preparation round about now?
Well, it's not really quite the same as a general election, I would say. It's rather different, this. I mean, it's a rather odd procedure anyway, this business of asking 130,000 elderly rural dwelling Conservatives who should be Prime Minister. So I don't think it will follow wholly the normal procedures. I doubt there will be the same spread of consultations about policy and procedures and so on would normally be. Clearly there will be discussions with the Cabinet Secretary. I would have thought there would be less with individual ministries, simply because who knows who the future ministers are going to be. They may be the same ones we have now in several cases, or at least they'll still be ministers if in a different department. So they won't need the degree of indoctrination which a party which has been out of power for, say, 20 years might otherwise need.
But do you see a lot of planning? Do you sense it? Do you sniff it? Or do you think it's not like that?
Well, personally, I think all planning is focused on no-deal Brexit, and probably it has to be.
What's your impression of if you're guessing now, what a Boris Johnson administration will shape up to be like? One permanent secretary said to me the other day it had an air of Lady Jane Grey about it. 9 days, I think that one was. What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I think as Charles says, the whole focus is going to be on a no-deal Brexit and trying to get that. So I suppose the pattern will be that If Boris Johnson is the leader, he comes in, he appoints his cabinet, and he immediately embarks on trying to negotiate with the EU. I assume the EU is not going to want to renegotiate the exit agreement or the backstop. He'll therefore find himself frustrated. Whatever he can achieve on the future negotiation, on the political declaration, he'll find himself frustrated on that, and then he's going to face a very difficult choice because Parliament is against a no-deal Brexit. So what's he going to do in those circumstances? Does he call an election, or does he actually stand on his head and call a referendum?
What would you guess?
I would guess, there's no point in guessing with Boris Johnson, he could do anything. I mean, if you can write 2 articles about Brexit, you can write 2 articles on whether to have a referendum or an election and choose one of them.
Charles, what's
Well, I
your
don't
sense?
disagree with Jonathan's sort of projection of what are the likely next steps. Though I personally think an election is the more likely and the more proper procedure. What concerns me more is really that we are in a phase of political decay. I think the referendum has hijacked our normal constitutional procedures, and it's led to this obsessive concern with one subject. And that means that it's very difficult for a political party in power to recover from that sort of situation. That is why an election is actually the better thing, because at least it gives you a fresh start. Whoever wins it, it's a fresh start, and therefore a new baseline. So I think we're in for a period of muddle, confusion, and further decline, both in our economy and in our standing in the world, until these issues are resolved and somebody can take a grip. I sense no feeling of leadership anywhere in either of the main political parties or indeed the whole political system. And that is pretty devastating. I mean, I worked for a Prime Minister who showed extremely strong, sometimes erratic, but very strong leadership, and so did Jonathan, for another Prime Minister whom I admire for his leadership. I don't sense that anywhere at the moment.
And you don't think Boris Johnson's going to bring it? He says he will.
Well, I mean, the fact he says it, he hasn't produced any evidence for it in the shape of policies. A few promises to spend ever more money to buy ever more constituencies of voters and get their approval. But I don't sense policies, strategies, no.
Same for you?
I think the problem, as Charles says, is the political system is broke at the moment. It's really unfortunate, but we've ended up in a situation with no political leadership on either side of the aisle in our political system. And people playing fast and loose with a constitution that isn't written is therefore very subject to being bent and could end up a real cropper. So I really think that this is a very difficult and dangerous time, and I see no evidence of some political leadership to come through and save it.
You talked, Charles, about how it'll be difficult to build up British influence again. Isn't it the case, though, that history teaches us when you have moments like this and the lift crashes down a lot of floors, you actually don't go back up? This is a defining, shrinking moment.
Well, actually, I deeply disagree with you about that, but I do believe that in the 1970s, this country was on its back in various 3-day weeks and strikes and trade unions running the country and the economy crashing and going to the IMF. And yet, by the end of the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher had restored not just the country, but more importantly, our standing in the world. I mean, as a result of restoring the country, she restored our standing. And that is an enormously difficult thing to do, and it takes a long time, and it requires, as we've just been saying, leadership. So it's doable, but it's only doable by people who have the passion for the country, the passion for leadership, and the ideas, even if they're sometimes a bit way out, as to how it can be done.
You're nodding, Jonathan.
I agree that it can be rebuilt and it does require leadership, but I was going to say, in addition to what Charles says, I do think you need some pillars for your foreign policy. And our foreign policy has been based since the Second World War on 3 originally pillars, though the Commonwealth has rather fallen away, but on the European pillar and the transatlantic pillar. And the problem is that if we do pull out of the European Union, or even if we decide to stay in the European Union, our European pillar is going to be a very, very weak one on which to build a foreign policy. And unfortunately, transatlantic relationships, not just because of the recent release of the classified comments on Donald Trump, but anyway, was extremely weak. And if we have neither of those pillars, no amount of leadership will pull us back up.
And I would add just one more thing. I think there is a third pillar these days to replace, in a way, the Commonwealth, and that's China. And I think we'd be mad to undermine the relationship we've built up with China. Of course, we have to be straight with them on Hong Kong and direct and talk straight. But basically, we need a relationship with China, particularly after Brexit. I mean, that will be our big target for trade. And if we both leave Europe and abandon a good relationship with China, then we really are in trouble.
When you're trying to take a historical perspective on all of this, do you think Brexit might look more like a blip in the great scheme of things when you look at, for instance, China's growing power in the world, changes to technology, all the sort of stuff one hears about artificial intelligence and many other technological changes coming towards us? Where will it feature, do you think, on the historical graph?
Well, personally, it won't be the sort of the First World War or the Battle of Waterloo or anything like that, which will be taught in history books. No, I don't think that. I think it will be seen as rather like east of Suez. Let's take that as an example. You have the idea of scuttling from east of Suez, forced on us by a weak economy and weak leadership. It'll be seen as a slightly shameful episode in British political and diplomatic history, as will the Suez adventure itself, of course, 15 years before that.
Obviously, we never put the troops back in Suez. Would we ever go back in to the European Union?
I think it would be extremely difficult to do so. I mean, my general principle in life is never try and go back. I mean, I never wanted to go back into the civil service, having abandoned it for business. I mean, there might have been opportunities, but it seemed to me, once you've done something, don't go back in life. And I think the same applies to nations. You can't go back in quite the same way.
Same question to you, Jonathan. The big scheme, historical scheme of things, how do you think it will be judged and future generations study this chapter?
Well, we haven't actually left yet, and I'm still hoping we won't. So maybe the chapter will be slightly different.
Percentage chance of that, do you think now?
Oh, I'd say it's 50-50, whether we're going to leave or not leave. I think it's very, very unclear. I mean, if you did have another referendum, the polls at the moment show you would at least have a chance of winning a Remain vote in that. And as we enter into recession, as we're now beginning to do, I think the impact of that would be even greater. I slightly disagree with Charles. I do think this will be a bigger step than even the Suez. I think that east of Suez he was talking about, but even the Suez disaster, I think this will be seen as an act of self-inflicted harm of a quite extraordinary nature by a country. And something that actually has changed the nature of our politics, because what you see now, if you look at opinion polls, is that people no longer identify with political parties in the way that they did. You're down to about 30% in some opinion polls identifying with political parties, and you have 70% identifying as Remain or Leave. So it's become a new dividing line in British politics. So I think it will be quite an important step, both internally and externally in our influence in the world.
Where do you think it leaves our politics, the end of this crisis, assuming we can see an end one day?
Well, I see it leaving us with a weakened political system, an undermined constitution.
New parties?
I'm very sceptical of new parties. I'm being a year or two older than Jonathan. I've seen parties come and go, and they've mostly gone after a short coming period. I mean, if you think of the talents of Roy Jenkins and his colleagues, Shirley Williams and so on, is setting up the original Social Democratic Party, and how they were unable in the end to get any purchase. I think that might be the same in the future, but I know that Jonathan is more optimistic and believes there is scope now in these circumstances for new political parties to emerge. Perhaps I'm just too cynical.
You're being cast as the wide-eyed idealist.
Which, although has lived a very long time, hasn't lived quite long enough to see the rise of the Unionist, Conservative and Unionist Party, the Liberal Party and the Independent Labour Party. So it does happen, it just has quite big gaps between it. I think what's interesting in the current circumstances is that people have come loose from their political parties. We saw that in the European elections, we saw that in the local elections. It's the highest period of turbulence in terms of the way people vote we've ever experienced while polling has existed. And I think the basic coalitions that underpin the political parties have broken down. So at the last election, the Conservative Party had more working class voters than the Labour Party had. So class is no longer the defining aspect of voting. And if voting moves from class to identity, as it has in the United States, for example, then you end up with very different political parties. Now, we have a very sticky system with the first past the post, so maybe it won't happen. But if it's ever going to happen, I think now is when it will.
But we've seen it tried in recent months. It didn't even barely take off from the runway, a new political party.
No, that's entirely true. The Change UK, I salute their braveness in trying, but they made a number of mistakes, I think, that were reasons that they failed, but doesn't mean the idea itself fails, that they went early and unprepared, they went without having really thought through the consequences, they ended up as a one-issue party on Brexit and nothing else, and they failed to cohere with the other bits in the centre. You can't have lots of different political parties in the centre. They should have cooperated with the Liberals and others. There's only space for one force in the centre, not for lots of them.
That's how it could happen, and you think really it might.
I still think there's a good chance, but then I'm always an optimist.
And we're talking about a general election potentially, as Charles was saying, not a million miles away. I mean, if not this year, then maybe in the first half of next year is not unthinkable. that creates another whole problem for a new force in British politics, or an opportunity?
What do you think of the SDP? If the election had been in 1982 as opposed to 1983, the SDP was at 50% in 1982, so they could have actually won in those circumstances. So there's a paradox for a new political party. It needs to exist not too long before a political election, so people lose interest in it, but not too soon, so it has time to prepare.
And that's the lesson of Macron's En Marche as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about this, because this is a related point. Are we in a populist era or a populist moment, Charles? Is this a new dispensation that's going to last a long time?
No, I don't think we are. And I do particularly think we've got to be careful not to sound like sort of discontented retired colonels from Cheltenham about our national future. I mean, we have our misgivings. I certainly have misgivings about aspects of it. But the fact is, particularly if you think like a civil servant, and then we've both been civil servants, your job is to make the best of it and try and help whatever government is in power to overcome the problems, even if they're self-inflicted problems. And so one has to try and take a positive view about the future and how we make the best of a post-Brexit if that's what happens. There are a lot of things one can do, whether it's in the area of lowering corporate taxation to make us ever more competitive and challenge our European neighbours on that score, whether it's in trying to firm up other relationships, as I mentioned the ones with China, but not just China, Japan and elsewhere in Asia. After all, that's where the future is if you take a 50 to 100-year view. And we should be playing a bigger role than we do in Asia, I mean, whether it's in the defence area. And I think actually Mr. Williamson was quite right to be sending some ships there, not aircraft carriers, because we didn't actually have them yet, but I mean to have a presence in the area in support of our allies in the area. That's the sort of thing you can do and make a mark with. So I think I would want to see people once this issue is resolved, take an optimistic view of what needs to be done and go to it with a will to make the best of it.
Your point on populism is, I think it's clear there is a new wave of populism, because it's not just in Britain, it's in Germany, it's in Italy, it's in the United States. So clearly there is a populist challenge, and it's understandable why this has appeared, given the stagnant wages of those and the majority of the workforce. Like, it's perfectly understandable why it's happened. The question is whether anyone's going to do something about this and find some practical answers to address those concerns and try and put the country back on a positive direction and take it away from populists like Farage. And it's not going to happen by itself. Someone will actually have to stand up and do that. And that's what I'm interested in, is the political leadership out there to make this happen.
And not just in this country. I mean, I think one thing that could have quite an effect was just suppose that against the odds, Trump fails to get re-election next year. And there was a Democrat administration, whether it was led by Biden or Senator Harris or whatever. That could very considerably change the calculus, I think, of many governments. I think countries in Europe would be less keen, with Trump removed, on Mrs. Le Pen or Salvini in Italy and others. I think really you could see the reverberations of that. Because I do think populism is partly an imitation of Trump, and what must seem to the eyes of populists in Europe, Trump's success.
You obviously expect President Trump to get re-elected, though?
I think the odds favour it at the moment, certainly, yes.
So populism might actually get a bit more wind in its sails in Europe.
I think it could equally do so, yeah. But
do you think the EU survives in its current form into the medium or distant
Well, I'd be
term?
pretty confident it won't advance any further. I think it's probably reached its high water mark, and if anything will go slightly backwards. I don't think it's going to fall to pieces, no.
But in terms
I
of
think
more integration?
it's overreached in terms of integration already. And the difficulty that President Macron is experiencing in pushing forward his ideas on closer economic and financial convergence are evidence that in the enlarged community that is not simply going to run. I mean, you've got different views from the former East European, former Warsaw Pact countries who don't want to go any further. And I mean, I hate to say this, but it does rather justify a certain speech given by Margaret Thatcher quite a number of years ago, which made this point, that there's no point in pushing countries too far to giving up their sovereignty, losing their distinctive national characteristics, and integrating ever more, but do what you can do well together, and things you do better alone, do that. And I think that may well become the pattern of the future.
Do you remind me who wrote that speech?
Well, I can't remember. It must have been a highly intelligent,
someone in number 10,
person.
I think it was. Yeah.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
You've risked the annoyance of other disciples of Margaret Thatcher by speculating that she would not have backed Brexit.
She would never have backed Brexit, no. She's far too sensible for that. First of all, she would never have tolerated a referendum. She regarded a referendum as the devil's work. It was an instrument of tyranny. It flew in the face of our constitutional tradition of electing representatives and letting them decide. And she would have negotiated much harder in Europe in the same way she did over our budgetary contribution, making the lives of all other European governments miserable for 5 or 6 years in order to get enough of our way to enable us to stay in, with all sorts of opt-outs and goodness knows what, but we would still be inside there.
You mentioned the crusty old establishment figure that you would not like to be seen as, but am I looking at the establishment? A pair of brothers who managed to, between them, dominate, have a significant role in, you'll probably be more comfortable with, British policy over 2 decades. Isn't that exactly the sort of thing that people were revolting against when they pressed the populist button in
Well,
this
Jonathan
country
thinks
and
of
a
a
few other
better
countries?
answer. I would say not entirely, because I don't think either of us ever filled establishment positions. I mean, the establishment is cabinet secretaries, permanent secretaries, generals and field marshals and that
It's
sort
just
of thing.
oiks below there.
Yeah, below that level, they're basically oiks, but sometimes rather sort of fortunate oiks who got themselves into positions perhaps of unusual influence or, one hesitates to say power, but at least influence on decisions and on how they were taken and how they were articulated. So I think in a way we were both outside the establishment, despite having started our working lives within an establishment institution, the Foreign Office.
Does that ring a bell? You do see yourself as some sort of bohemian?
My God,
No,
don't say that.
I'm a bohemian. but
At least I'm wearing a tie.
I spent most of my life being an irritant and trying to change things from within the system. I mean, not many people on the right, for example, were very happy with what we did in Northern Ireland and coming out with a peace agreement and still spend time criticising it or trying to undermine it with things like a backstop. So no, I don't think we would be typical of the establishment. The establishment is more the problem that we face at the moment of what was won on the battlefield, on the playing fields of Eton, being lost on the playing fields of Eton, and that's the real establishment at work, not people like us, I think.
You're the outsiders who popped in and then popped out again.
That would be my view, certainly.
We're the servants, that's what the point is, it's civil servants.
Tell me where what home life was like, because people, the Powell phenomenon. Sorry, before we get there, am I pronouncing the name correctly?
You are, at his purposes, yes.
You should pronounce it the proper Welsh way. It's a Welsh name, which is Apul.
Apul.
We'll forgive you, don't worry.
What was home life like? Some people might imagine it an extraordinary sort of engine of ambition. You were being sort of catapulted out the door to get to the top of the tree. What was it like?
I think we had a very conventional upbringing, would be my view. Our father was a senior Royal Air Force officer who sacrificed everything, actually, he and our mother, to give us good education, and then left us to get on with it. And I think in both our cases was pleased to see us go into the public service. But we had 2 other brothers who went into business, and in many ways probably succeeded more than we did, and certainly in terms of income. And so we, as a family as a whole, we were well spread across government. Our next brother down, the number 2 one, in the advertising world, where he rose to great heights, running England's 2nd biggest agency. The other one in the technology world, where he ended up running a lot of American technology companies. So I wouldn't like to say we were just obsessed with power or civil service influence and rank and that sort of thing. No, I think we were just given a good education and told, now it's over to you.
You must have been asked this, Jonathan, over the years, particularly as you were following 15 years behind.
16.
16?
I was 78 yesterday.
Oh, happy birthday. What was it a laboratory of ambition you were growing up in? It does seem odd that you both ended up at the top of the government tree.
No, just a coincidence that there are. It was a very conventional family. Our parents were both swing voters, voted 45, voted for the Labour Party, voted for Tories while Charles was working for Thatcher, voted for Labour while I was working for Tony Blair. I think politically, it wasn't actually particularly charged politically as a household at all. It was much more conventional than that.
And then the different directions your politics go in.
Well, I
What do you
don't
think
accept
explains
that
that?
I have politics. I mean, I don't want to seem too sort of sanctimonious, but I never got involved directly in politics, nor wanted to. I thought what I did was working for the government, was independent in the sense, I worked for Labour governments in the Foreign Office, and I worked latterly for the Conservative Prime Minister rather closely for a long time. But I didn't feel that I was a party supporter particularly. I thought I was a government.
But I think I can detect a different political outlook.
Well, of course, you are one of the most perceptive political commentators in whole of Westminster carrier. I knew you wouldn't like me to say that, but I do say it. But yeah, all right. Yeah.
I am picking up traces of a different politics in,
but maybe
in your
slightly
outlooks.
less than you think. I mean, on some issues, yes, I'm sure there is quite a wide gap between
Do you think
us.
Jonathan could have served Margaret Thatcher?
I actually think he could have, yes.
I did serve Margaret Thatcher. I was the third secretary in the Foreign Office working on South Africa when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister.
At a higher level, you could have done that?
I'm not sure I could have done the job that Charles did, but I'm sure I could have worked somewhere in the civil service at that period in the same way that people have managed to work under Theresa May and no doubt will work under Boris Johnson.
Someone suggested to me the question, who's winning?
Between?
The two of you.
Oh,
Maybe the four.
I don't think, I don't regard myself as in any sort of competition, certainly no longer. I'm more interested in the next generation than my generation. I think we've both been very lucky, very fortunate, from having very exciting, interesting careers. I hope on the whole we've done good. I think I would certainly say we've tried to.
He had a head start, otherwise I'd have won.
And so, I mean, it sounds a bit sort of self-satisfied and smug, I know, but I mean, I don't think we've ever consciously misused whatever power and influence we had, or have wanted to, thought to. We both had the fortune, really, of working for prime ministers who, in their time, were highly successful and basically are still regarded as having been successful. And I think history will treat them as probably the only two prime ministers worth mentioning between Attlee and some point in the future.
It could be said, couldn't it, that the biggest figure on the political stage in Britain since either of your two bosses, the most influential figure, is Nigel Farage?
Well, in a destructive sense rather than a positive sense, yes. I mean,
But the biggest impact?
Impact in terms of bringing... Well, he hasn't actually ever won a seat in Parliament. He has never managed to get into government, thank God. But he has managed to change politics in a particular direction, or to ride a change that was happening in politics and impersonate it. But the trouble with these populists is that they aren't actually very authentic politicians. They're people who are pretending to be things. Just as in Trump you have a billionaire pretending to be a populist who sympathises with the blue-collar workers of the United States. That synthetic populism will wear out fairly quickly.
But he's had an impact.
And it's had an impact, but at the end of the day, if you're just a single subject person, you're not really affecting the country.
But he's knocked all the other subjects off the block.
Well, only because he's knowing about them. I mean, he's just got this single-minded obsession with Brexit, and it's shared by some members of the Conservative Party. I mean, Bill Cash, for instance, doesn't sort of spend 5 minutes without thinking about Brexit. But you can't run a country and really influence a country's future just on that alone.
But he wouldn't have had that success if it hadn't been for other people making mistakes. If David Cameron hadn't called that referendum at that stage and given him the opportunity, he would have carried on being in the fruit and nut stall.
But we're seeing the collapse of the, to some people's eyes, the centre-left in this country, the radicalisation of the right. Nigel Farage, the biggest impact on British politics. Is there any sense in which either of the bosses that you worked for bears some of the responsibility for that?
I would say definitely not in the case of the one I did. I think she would never have enabled Nigel Farage to emerge.
He worshipped
because she would have dominated, yes, but she would not have worshipped him, I'm afraid, because she would not see in him.
Somehow.
I'm sorry?
Maybe she fed it somehow.
I don't think so. I don't think so. She took a very rational view on Europe. She wanted to stay, Britain to be in it, and if you read what she said in various speeches, she always said that we should remain part of Europe or seek to change it from within. And that was a sensible way to proceed. He just wants us to pull out. She always condemned people who walked away from issues and problems. She thought the Soviet Union was wrong to walk out of the Security Council in the 1940s in its own interests. She thought de Gaulle was wrong to have walked out of NATO at the time. She believed profoundly that you needed to be part of an institution, particularly in your immediate area, and play a part in it, try and change it, shape it more in your own direction. And for a while she did, for heaven's sake, when what was the most constructive thing ever done in Europe, frankly, since it was formed in 1957, it was a single market. That's why it's so shameful that we're leaving it now.
Under the influence of so many of her disciples.
a number of her so-called disciples.
Would Tony Blair would you be inclined to park any of the responsibility for the current state of the centre-left with Tony Blair? Would he, in a self-flagellating mode, perhaps take on some of the responsibility for that?
I mean, only in the sense that all history is linked, and so what's gone before tends to have an influence on what happens later, but certainly not, I don't think in any way he could be seen as the forerunner of Farage or anything like that. So did the steps we take on Europe mean that Europe didn't become as popular as we would have liked in the UK? Yes, possibly it did. Maybe we should have done more to try and sell Europe to Britain rather than selling Britain to Europe, which is where we were trying to actually get a leadership role for Britain inside the EU. Maybe we should have focused on the domestic. So sure, plenty of mistakes were made, but to try and directly link that, it's not the same as the way in which David Cameron called a referendum when he didn't need to, on an issue in which people didn't really vote on the issue.
You're aiming at the wrong target, Gary. I mean, the target shouldn't be people who did display strong leadership. It should be those who succeeded and who failed to display leadership, who should be held accountable for what's gone on since.
Is this a frequent occurrence, the two of you sitting together during the cut, or is it
Well, not in front of a television camera, it's not.
fairly infrequent? People wonder
Well,
anthropology
occasional,
of the Powell family.
occasional. I don't think we
I suppose
don't
many
shun
people
each
wonder,
other.
but yeah, of course we have conversations about it, but as Charles says, not usually with a television camera.
Well, thank you for sitting in front of this one. Charles Powell, Jonathan Powell, thank you very much for your time.